Hello, Mzansi. You are listening to the world's best podcast, presented by WAN EFRA Digital Media Awards, Food for Mzansi's Farmers Inside Track podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Tembo. Welcome to episode 433. Today, we're speaking to Dr. Buhlebelive Mndzebele from the Agricultural Research Council based in Potchefstroom. We will be speaking to him about his research titled Effects of Intercropping Cowpea Amaranth and Fertilizer Application on Crop Growth, Soil Phosphate Activities, and Available Soil Phosphorus. His research tackles significant issues such as population growth, limited land, and climate challenges in South Africa, with focus on indigenous vegetables and intercropping as sustainable methods. Thank you so much for joining us on Farmers Inside Track. Please introduce yourself and your scope of work.
My name is Buhlebelive Mndzebele. I'm a researcher at the Agricultural Research Council in one of the institutes. It's called Grain Crops. We're working with all the grains in South Africa. I'm based in Potchefstroom.
Thank you. It's really lovely to meet you. Going through your research on cowpea amaranth plant and how it utilizes nitrogen, could you explain to us how the research came about and what prompted the idea?
The research, how it came about, is looking at our population. I was looking at to say we have an increased population in South Africa, more towards having a lot of people in the rural communities. Now, as people are increasing in number, those people have to eat, and not only eat, but also have nutritious food. And also the other thing that we have, which is a problem in South Africa, is the issue of land that is limited. The distribution of land does not allow the accommodation of a bigger population. And also the issue of climate change, low rainfall, high temperatures. So I was looking at all those challenges to say, okay, if one were to bring in some kind of intervention, what kind of research approach would one do? That's when I then came up with introducing what we call our indigenous vegetables. That was cowpea and amaranth. And then intercropping them more towards optimizing of space, saying to anyone who might say, no, they have got limited land, less land, at least we're saying within that limited space, grow whatever that you are able to grow, one crop next to another, and then you are able then to benefit from what the crop would, both crops would bring in terms of the yield and the nutrition. The other thing that we have in South Africa, why it's important that we even went for the study, our soils are very low in nutrients. Phosphorus is one of them. They are low in nitrogen, low in potassium. Those challenges for me, they really say, no, how does one try and contribute towards those problems?
Definitely. You spoke about indigenous vegetables. Are they better at utilizing the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that is very low in our soil?
And what is happening with our indigenous vegetables, they're highly adaptable. If you're saying indigenous vegetables, it's amaranth, cleome, they easily grow. Most of the people, they call them weeds. Alongside, if you've grown your maize, they just grow on their own. So for me, when it comes to efficient utilization of resources based on their behavior, that they would even grow without much resource in terms of applying fertilizer in even water, I would then say they are better efficient in terms of utilizing of nutrients.
So with intercropping, is that also a sustainable method in farming, maybe with the indigenous vegetables? Is that something you would suggest to a farmer?
Intercropping for me, I think it's one way of saying it's one of the sustainable farming methodologies. Why that's the case? It is because if you are looking at intercropping, it's different ways of doing it, but then the common one is just raw intercropping, where you would have one crop next to another and they would come in rows. So in that case, it means that you kind of cover as much ground as possible. So what would happen that below the ground, the roots would kind of interrupt. Then if that happens, then you would have minimum soil erosion. So it means that you would have two plants that are holding the soil together. That would be an advantage. And the other thing is when you are looking at the intercropping also, when you bring in the legume, you are minimizing the application of a fertilizer. Legumes, they are able to harness atmospheric nitrogen and also able to help in the optimization of phosphorus in the soil. So what would happen if you have a legume, then you are indirectly reducing the need of the application of fertilizer to the companion crop, the one that would actually grow next to it. And I think if you then bring in a legume in this context, cowpea, you make that kind of environment friendly in terms of this application of fertilizer. Yes, some people might say, no, let's put something, but I'll say that there is not much that would be required. So you bring in environmentally friendly kind of environment that would be friendly also to the soil, also helping to build in the healthy soils. If you've got legumes, over time, they will biodegrade and then contribute more towards the soil structure and also the addition of nutrients onto the soil.
So the conclusions that you did come to was that you'd use less fertilizer with the intercropping method. So the farmers in South Africa, especially commercial farming, they're very reliant on fertilizer. What sort of mindset or approach would you advise for a farmer who is reliant on fertilizer? Because it's not necessarily the most sustainable.
My approach would be when it comes to fertilizer has got its own benefits, but looking at the bigger population, in South Africa, the smallholder farmers and the commercial, broadly speaking, there could be others like in between. But my study was more looking towards the smallholder farmers who are more in terms of the population to say, how would those ones be able to actually manage? So when it comes to fertilizers, the major challenge is the issue of costly. They're quite costly, where that, when there is instabilities politically, they tend to then affect prices of even fertilizers. One of those, the major inputs that go into the formulation of fertilizer, it then increases, then fertilizers increase. What would mean is that the end user then would have to foot a higher bill for them to put food on the table. And then the farmer also has to contribute more towards that. So the cost, and then the other thing is for smallholder farmers, access is a challenge. The way you would have the fertilizers, they are in certain specified locations where people have to drive in there and then get those kind of fertilizers. And I think that is also a downside to fertilizers, is the potential harm to the environment. One, when they handle it, fertilizer is a chemical. So when it comes to handling it, one has to be careful. And the other thing, also a potential harm to water bodies and the microbiota. We know that in the soil, there would be some animals that live under there, and then also a bit of life below the soil. The minute you introduce chemicals, you then move those ones away, and those play an important part in the soil. So what I would say to a farmer is that one should look at soil that is the resource that is available, that has to be used by generations. Then if one uses those kind of approaches, we would have a situation where, yes, a farmer would not get as much high yield as they might desire, but then they would have that resource available for future generations. Because what we also have in South Africa is that there's a bit of what is called functional land that is tired, that would need to require rest. So for one to avoid that, you go for a slower approach where you don't pump the soil with so much fertilizer, and then you take care of it so that what you have now, 15, 20, 30 years, you still have it functional. Because the issue of food and nutritional security, it is an important aspect. We still have to eat. Our generations have to eat. Generations after us have to eat also. and food can be obtained by us utilizing the soil. Yes, there could be other methodologies where people would say, no, we can use other ways of feeding ourselves, but more towards accommodating the bigger population, smallholder farmers, rural communities. Then our soils should be healthy. And then if we go for approaches not to overburden them with fertilizers, then I would go for that approach myself towards including of legumes, because legumes are the ones that also contribute towards us getting nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil.
It's a very important study that you've done. I see that it addresses the sustainable development goals, like number 2 and I believe 15, that speak to food security and also just stewarding natural resources well. Do you believe that we'll see policies changing to favor studies such as this one that consider the sustainability of farming methods in terms of our soil and water resources?
One would try, or harm in trying, because there is a group that I'm part of, is called Biologicals, where we are trying to say what alternatives would we bring into the table alongside the conventional ones, which is chemical based. And that policy, unfortunately, our approach when we had one of the meetings, we had a challenge where they couldn't allow us to be a standalone. So our approach of saying, let's bring in biologicals, some things to do with organic farming, sustainable production, conservation agriculture, all those approaches, it has to go alongside with available policy. I think that into the future one can really try and push it, because what we have as a country, and not only South Africa, if we are not careful in taking care of our own resources, land, one of them that should give us food, will be in serious challenges and not be able to feed ourselves. And then if we are not able to feed ourselves, there will be a serious crisis in the country. That would be even worse than the World War, because, hunger is what everyone should have, irrespective of whether you are in a rural community, a urban community. But land has to support those aspects. So for me, policy, we can try and contribute our bit towards policy and also lobby for us to be a standalone. We might not necessarily say we compete or we undo the other side of agriculture with this chemical production, inorganic fertilizers and all those aspects. That one can also play its role, but our approach would be to say, if we have our own part in the policy and then have an inclusive approach to say, okay, we have also rural communities participating in the economy with whatever ways of production, and then more people would be sustainable. If you have more people participating, then it means that there would be less hunger, even though people might not necessarily be able to be in those higher brackets in terms of the economy, having more money. But at least if a typical homestead in Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape, wherever in those deep rural areas, someone wakes up, they've got sufficient food, they are able to sort out their protein problems, vitamin, iron and zinc challenges to the vegetables, all those things would have done quite a lot in our country. And then you also have the same person growing potatoes, baby sweet potatoes, even though they could be somewhere deep in the rural areas. And then you would have a situation where now they would be able to actually feed themselves and be better off.
Do you have any tips and suggestions for farmers who are looking to change their farming practices toward intercropping? Because I understand that the transition can be challenging. What would your advice then be for farmers seeking to change to more sustainable practices like intercropping?
My advice would be a typical smallholder farmer who does not have sufficient land. I would promote or recommend intercropping, to say if someone has got 1 hectare or whatever amount of land that they would have in a rural area, Intercropping, what it does, it allows the farmer to utilize the space efficiently. For instance, if someone has got amaranth or cowpea, or maybe if it's maize, they put a legume so that what they have, they're then able to utilize their space efficiently. From where I'm sitting myself, is that I would recommend that. But then when it comes to someone then who would say they want to make money and generate as much income as possible, and then when they are supposed to maybe grow one crop, it might not really work for them. But then a typical farmer who just wants to feed themselves, because they also the issue of intercropping, it makes mechanization very difficult. Actually, once you have intercropping, then you have to go the manual route. It means that you are not then able to have a tractor or anything to manage things in the field. It means that you have to go the manual, because where the tractor is supposed to move, that's where you have your crops. But then for me, based on, and also to kind of preserve human dignity and have everyone to eat, let the little land that we have put as much vegetables, crops as possible, so that we are able to actually feed ourselves. Because out of intercropping, if you've got more than one crop, then you are able to have your protein source, you have your vitamins, your ions, your macronutrients, your trace elements, you have everything within that limited space. So looking at that approach, not necessarily looking at making money now, then for me that's what I would say. Yes, in intercropping, a person can still make money, but it's a bit of intensive in terms of labor, working the land and as moving between the field to try and do activity in that space. But it's doable, more towards us looking at accommodating as many people as possible, where every family, wherever in a rural area, can actually easily do intercropping, and then they will be able to feed themselves. So I'm leaning more towards that myself than us giving few people to feed the whole nation. But then if we are able to feed ourselves also, whilst we're still waiting for other interventions, we will be far better off.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buhlebelive Mndzebele, researcher at the Agricultural Research Council. For more information on the topic, visit www.foodforumzansi.co.za. And that's a wrap. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platforms. From me, Patricia Tembo, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #team Food for Mzansi, thank you for listening.
Life in South Africa can be a lot. I mean, scroll through Twitter for a minute and tell me I'm wrong. Thank God for South Africans though, right? We're inspiring, and even on the bad days, we fight back with a smile. That's why I love Food for Mzansi so much. They're not ashamed to celebrate the ordinary unsung heroes who work every day to put food on our nation's tables. Go to foodformzansi.co.za and never miss an inspiring story.